Hello, and a special welcome to students at North Oxfordshire Academy. Hello, I'm Philip S Davies, and in case you don't know, I volunteer as the resident author at your school. We hoped I might be able to come in to meet you in person, but that isn't possible at the moment. So instead, I'm speaking to you from my little back bedroom, which is my writing study. This is where my stories get written. And the most important part is that I've got a lovely view out of my study window, a park and fields and a valley with hills in the distance. This is important because of the time I spend gazing out of the window, thinking. Most story writing is not actually typing, getting the words down, but dreaming, wondering, creating, working out what happens next. Getting to know my characters, in other words, thinking. And each day I also go for a long walk out the back in order to think. But what does a resident author do? I'm not resident as in that the librarian, Mrs. Hopkin, keeps me locked up in a cupboard behind one of the bookshelves and only lets me out when I'm needed. No, it means that I normally can visit school regularly. Some of you may have had author visits to your primary schools, perhaps for World Book Day, which is in March each year. But not many schools have a resident author, and it's because I live in Banbury that I was able, before coronavirus, to pop into school every week. I've helped with open evenings and careers fairs, and every Thursday lunchtime I help to run a creative writing club in the school library. I would set a title and a deadline, giving you a few weeks to write something, and then read and enjoy your writing, awarding prizes of chocolate or donuts or chocolate or Haribos or chocolate. You get the idea. The aim is to encourage you to have a go at creative writing. We all have imaginations, and with a bit of prompting and encouragement and a chance to try, I am always amazed and bowled over with what you young people come up with. But as well as creative writing, I see my role as encouraging you to read for pleasure. Yes, you'll have books to study for English, set texts, poems, plays, non-fiction, but it's vitally important to make time as well, if you can, to read what you enjoy. Many of you will have started a good reading habit at primary school, and the challenge is to keep that going through secondary school. Find the genres and authors and sorts of books you like, because reading for pleasure is the single thing that will help you the most throughout your school career and beyond. So, after all of that, I'm an author, and I've been invited to talk about my books. So what do I write? My stories are fantasy adventure novels for young people. And this banner here is the cover for my first book, Destiny's Rebel. And it's a trilogy, a series of 3, with Destiny's Revenge, the second book, the blue one, and the third book, Destiny's Ruin, which is green. That's the set of the 3. So what are they about? They're the story of Kat, Catalin, a 17-year-old girl who just happens to have been born a princess. At the start, she's days away from coming of age and inheriting her kingdom. And she is dreading it, because becoming queen will bring responsibility and expectations and conflict. She decides to run away, to assert her freedom, rebel against her destiny. But when she's captured and discovers a threat to her kingdom, she needs to race to get back in time for her coronation and to save her people. But does she even want to? Because that will mean accepting her fate as queen. I suppose the theme of the books is the things we can and can't choose about our lives. We can't choose, for example, when or where we're born, who our parents are, who else is in our family, or what sort of upbringing we get. What we can choose, once we're old enough to decide for ourselves, is what we do with the start in life we've been given. So Catelyn objects that she didn't ask to be born a princess. And what if she wants to do something else with her life? Where is her free will or choice in that? Or can she decide to carve out her own destiny? I won't give away what happens, but there are elements of needing to be true to who we are, to face up to responsibilities rather than run away from them, and that we might not need to face them alone. The books are set in an imaginary medieval world, the Western Coast, because I love castles and kingdoms, swords and sailing ships. They're fast-paced adventure stories full of twists and turns, but I chose not to have dragons or goblins or wizards in these. They're human, political stories about the fate of a girl and her kingdom. The fantasy comes from a mythology of gods, both good and evil, and their powers in the world through their followers, and in a sacred relic. There's a separate story in each of the 3 books, but they follow each other in time, so I strongly recommend reading them in this order: Destiny's Rebel first, and then Destiny's Revenge, and then Ruin, because otherwise the later books give away what happens in the earlier ones. So I thought I'd give you a taste, if that's all right, by reading you the end of the first chapter. This is an action scene, so I hope that's all right with you all. Sit back and relax for a few minutes. 17-year-old Cat has rebelled against her destiny to be queen and decided to run away. She's escaped from the castle down to the harbour and boarded a sailing ship. It's a galleon called the Oyster Shell, under Captain Farag and first mate Jersel, and they're on the deck sailing out of the bay. "Look! Hermit's Isle! Look!" Cat jumped at the terrified shout from above. Craning her neck, she squinted upwards. The lookout in the crow's nest was flinging his arms to the west. Jersel yelled for the captain. Cat turned and saw the reason for his cry. The blood drained from her cheeks as she stared. Farag dashed from his cabin. "What is it?" he shouted up. "What do you see?" "Slavers!" the lookout screamed. "Slave traders!" Pandemonium broke out around her. The captain and Jersel drew weapons and shouted orders. The crew were running and yelling. Some leapt to the rail to look. Some ran to arm themselves. A few hurried to hide. The Oyster Shell's crew began to form a grim-faced line at the rail, clutching clubs and knives. From behind the wooded isle, a small black ship was springing its ambush, and the galleon was too slow to outrun it. "Come on, Cat, move." She sprinted to her cabin, threw off the cloak and grabbed her quiver and shortbow. She chose the height of the forecastle deck and scurried up the ladder. She'd just said to Jersel about doing her share when fighting started, but hadn't expected to prove it so soon. She slung on the quiver and readied her bow. Cat looked out and was transfixed. A black flag with crossed swords fluttered above bulging sails as the small black ship raced closer. Figures teemed on the slaver deck like ants with their nest disturbed. The slavers jeered and brandished their weapons. Cat waited in impatient dread, wishing her arrows were of better use against moving targets at a distance. Her stomach knotted, and she gripped her bow to stop her arms from shaking. Did slavers slaughter, she thought in sudden panic, or did they only kidnap? She wiped the sweat from her hands on her trousers. She had to get herself together. Concentrate. Breathe. Cat fired twice above the heads of the crew as the enemy ship approached, but couldn't see if she hit any target. The 2 hulls collided with a splintering crunch, and Cat staggered as the Oyster Shell lurched. The slavers threw grappling hooks to secure the ships and swarmed across. A dozen enemies reached the rail. Cries and curses filled the air with the clash of metal, wood and bone. Cat willed the crew to lunge and push, but more slavers were climbing towards them. The invaders gained the deck. Jersal's scimitar felled two, Farag's sword another, and a vicious melee broke out. The crew were falling, or being wrestled overboard by stronger arms. Cat fired her first clear shot, and an enemy crumpled with an arrow in his chest. She felled another, and then remembered the command of her arms master: find the leader, get the chief. And now she saw him. A swarthy brute stood at the rail, his long hair and black cape billowing. He was directing the slaughter with the point of his cutlass, and shrieking his commands with oaths and swearing. With her first enemies dead, a cold focus descended on Cat. Her arrow thudded into the slaver chief's shoulder, and he roared in pain. While Cat strung her next missile, he screamed at his minions to get her. She aimed at his head, and was startled by an unearthly sight, a flicker of crimson light in his eyes. She'd no time to worry about that. By instinct, the slaver chief ducked. Cat was quicker, and her arrow pierced his neck. That should have killed him. But the crimson light. To avoid Cat's aim, the injured chief dodged and weaved, but Jersal's scimitar came from behind and felled him to the deck. Before Cat could shoot again, 3 slavers swept aside 2 of the crew and reached the forecastle ladder. This shot had to count. Her arrow sped into an upturned face, and one fell from the ladder, screaming. With no time to reload, Cat dropped her bow and grabbed the wooden rails. She swung herself up and landed her boots on the skull of the nearest foe. He fell back too, but the third caught her ankle and stabbed a knife in her leg. Agony shot up Cat's body and forced itself out in a scream. She fumbled to whip out the dagger at her belt, but scrabbled to hold on as the slaver heaved her forwards. Her sweaty hands slipped on the wood. She flew from the ladder, and her head bounced hard off the deck. Fog closed in, with dizzying lights. Her limbs were too heavy. Why couldn't she get up? No, she mustn't rest, or drift away. Rough arms grabbed her, but her body wouldn't respond. Lifted up, and then she was falling. That's the end of chapter 1. If you want to know how it turns out and what happens to Cat, then obviously you'll need to read the books. There are copies of each of these 3 books in the school library, if they haven't been borrowed already. There are also copies in the Oxfordshire public libraries. Apart from that, if I can say so, the best place to get them is on Amazon. If anyone is with Kindle Unlimited, they're free, but otherwise the e-books are a couple of pounds each, with the paperbacks more. If anyone would like a signed paperback copy from me, that would be £7 each, and we could arrange that through Mrs. Hopkin. But remember, please, I'd love you during your time at school to read for pleasure and to have a go at creative writing. And I really hope that I'll be able to come in again soon and meet you in school. So, thank you very much, everyone, for listening.